Sartre, my father, and me. When my father's body gave in at the age of 67, there was no cause of death as such. His health was undoubtedly poorly. He was addicted to a range of pharmaceuticals, but none of the vital organs had stopped functioning. Strangely, my mother and I saw it coming. There were tears on the day, long before we could have known it was happening. And when it did happen, the relief of no longer having to care for a prostrate depressive seemed to justify it. In the next few months, there was oblivion. I had felt alienated from his dead body. I saw it wrapped in white cloth, in public, and I thought I was over the fact. Then, suddenly, a sharp, steely grief was boring into me. Within weeks, it had disoriented me so profoundly I could no longer recognize myself. Principally, it expressed itself through fear, a fear so primal that it rendered the greatest fears of my life ridiculous. And the worst part of it was that it had no object. It didn't belong in space or time. Only a solitary subject existed to suffer it, and that subject wasn't a self I could relate to. For the first time, I felt I was getting Jean-Paul Sartre's point about the self being separate from consciousness. I had read enough to be familiar with the concept, but I hadn't managed to bring it onto any experiential plane. Then, out of nowhere, everything was making sense. The notion of freedom as an unbearable burden of responsibility, the conflict between imagination and situation in life, and the way in which this could be made to fit in a radical ideological framework. Much like Baba's death, it turned out, consciousness had no cause. It was just there, inescapable, a force of nature with its own rules. Where yourself is something you might want to define, consciousness is nothing at all. Rather, it's a grief, a fear, capable of transforming you at will, negating you. But besides the self-consciousness dilemma, there was the look Baba gave me a few hours before he died. I was on my way out. I chose not to be with him, though I could intuit he would die. And there was something humiliating about this. For the rest of my life, I would have to accept being a person who preferred going out to sitting by his father's deathbed. It was a brief, vacant look. You could argue it meant nothing, but it taught me how hell really could be someone else's eyes. It would take me years to be able to remember my father without experiencing the abysmal horror of those days, but it seemed natural that I should seek out his own thoughts about Sartre eventually, and not only because it was his death that made existentialism real. However marginal and uncommitted, he remained a member of the generation of so-called intellectuals who engaged with both Marxism and French existentialism. People like Ibrahim Fethi and Yahya Tahir Abdullah were once his friends, but he only expressed admiration for Saad Zaghloul and Mustafa Nahas, both pashas. He referred not to 1952, but 1919 as the glorious moment at which Egyptians made a free historical choice. It seemed that through some warped ideological devolution, he had become a latter-day Wafdi, a liberal wanker of the homegrown variety, someone who saw the way out in a small elitist coterie who believed in fairness, charity, and empirical common sense. In 1989, he obsessed about the collapse of the Soviet Union, but never in a plaintive way. More than once he called Gorbachev courageous and commended the principles of perestroika. I have not been able to locate Abdurrahman Badawi's translation of Being and Nothingness, though I seem to recall him laboring over it. Maybe I've invented this memory. In my lifetime, he seldom read anything involved, beyond the law books of his profession and some early 20th century history. Occasionally he would pick up an old favorite, like Nikos Kazantzakis' Freedom and Death, and spend months reading and rereading it. In contrast to his revolutionary adolescence, he himself never recounted it to me, by the time I was old enough to discuss things, he could only adopt a reactionary stance. Very occasionally, he spoke about communist activity in the 50s. Once, in extremely simple terms, he described how Nasser had managed to either crush or co-opt all those who could have championed the cause. It would be easy to link his disillusion to the failure of the July Revolution. For many members of the generation in question, the 1967 war was the moment it all came down. Except that he never supported it in the first place. He was always vitriolic about Nasser, emphasizing the failures of what he saw as a coup d'etat, and lamenting the way in which the regime turned Egypt into a police state, a mega community of informers, a madhouse of personal ambition and political suicide. For him, Nasser was personally accountable for eliminating all hope for democracy and progress, let alone social transformation, which hope in the 1920s he firmly believed there had been grounds for husbanding. In his all but unique opinion, I think, the Sadat regime, which leftists decry as counter-revolutionary, was but a logical result of the reign of Nasser. Of the Marxism, some things did persist, and I don't mean the lingo he sometimes sarcastically reiterated, or the vast knowledge he must have had, judging by his library, most of which consists of cheap, popular edition paperbacks. Marxism manifested most prominently in his daily life. As someone who never drove, he refused to acknowledge the advantages of the taxi over the public bus, even when he started coming home with bumps and bruises from attempts to get on and off insanely chaotic, overcrowded vehicles. He was always class-conscious, something that paradoxically emerged in his rejection of the social implications of class. He would treat working-class people as equals. He never managed to cut his subordinates' salaries or otherwise exercise administrative authority at work. And in spite of despising his own background, petty bourgeoisie, he always stressed, he tended to share his money with hard-up relations and friends. I think he would have enjoyed being single and poor, a rare virtue indeed for an Arab Marxist. He owned very few things of his own and seldom bought clothes. Perhaps sympathy with the Wafd party was his way of reconciling his personality with the fact that after much resistance, he had conceded the role of middle-class husband and father. He owned electric appliances and sent his son to expensive educational institutions. He let his wife accumulate savings. But at the level of the intellect, none of this counted. What remained of Marxism in the way of mental activity had rather to do with the existentialist principles I came to discover the hard way. I say principles, not practices, for in the end my father's attachment to Sartre's notion of freedom and consciousness remained, tragically, a matter of wavering conviction and occasional verbal commentary, not one of personal expression. His admiration for free love, as it manifested in Sartre's relationship with Simone de Beauvoir, for example, would never go beyond just that, an admiration, something he could only express in conversation, as it were on the margins of life, and towards which, insofar as it belonged to him at all, he could only feel frustration. The same sense of ambivalence permeated his feelings about religion, and even, perhaps, Marx as prophet. To fend off the no doubt stifling awareness of being petty bourgeois, he would place himself in the category of muthaqafin, intelligentsia, a group apart who were agents of the transformation towards communist society. He would pronounce the word in a wavering tone, with a mixture of gravity and comic self-awareness. It was as if he realized that though it meant a lot to him, in the grander scheme of things it meant nothing. And so, too, with his response to my mother's religiosity, which at the surface level he neither rejected nor endorsed. He was capable of humoring her and others about religion and God, hypocritically, I felt, but at times it seemed he was just as capable of embracing these concepts. His belief in chance as the overriding rule of being in the world, his sense of reality as a place shaped wholly by the radical consciousness of those who chose to change it. All of this turns out, the more I think about it, to be the frail gesture of an isolated and powerless intellect. Contrary to his political discourse, which centered, with the exception of polemics directed at Nasser, on the evolution of modern Egypt and the beauty of 1919, he made frequent references to Sartre's contribution. He quoted him, recounted episodes of his novels and plays, remembered his famous visit to Egypt in 1967. With the dispassionate objectivity of an emotionally involved observer, he stated Sartre's position on Israel. Memorably, he would sometimes mention the way in which a Sartre character, fatally injured at war, asks the nurse, minutes before he dies, to touch him. Only at the moment of death, Sartre wrote, could imagination be free of the constraints of situation. And somewhat in the same vein, at the hospital where they failed to identify a terminal illness, when he was released, none of the doctors thought he would die. Baba developed a desire for the blonde nurse who attended to his needs. I've had to remove my mother's mattress to dig out the well-kept paperbacks he left behind. The flat was too small to accommodate all the books he owned, and in the wake of his death especially, my mother justifiably resorted to hiding them. Some half of the total number had the word Sartre in Arabic letters on the cover. The Virtuous Whore, Marxism and Revolution, No Exit, The Flies, What is Literature, The New Colonialism, Critique of Dialectical Mind. Lying in a large cardboard box at the other end of the house in English are my own nausea and the wall. As I walk from one room to the other, I can't help noting a kind of intergenerational continuity. But at the same time, it suddenly occurs to me, my interest in French existentialism has nothing to do with his. It is a mere coincidence, a historical accident, that we happen to have this particular thing in common. At a deeper level, I'd like to think what we do have in common is a tormented consciousness of being in the world, subject to dying suddenly, without a cause. I might have chosen to stay by his deathbed that fateful evening in 2000, and yet I reassure myself he would still have died alone.